There's so much to say on Parsha Shemot. Let's just talk just very briefly. I want to talk very briefly about the plague of darkness. There's a generally accepted principle, especially in Sifrei Chasidus, that every plague that afflicted the Jewish people was not just a plague for the Egyptians, but it was also some kind of blessing for the Jewish people. In other words, when God brings suffering to mankind because God is all good, then that suffering is in some way, there's a flip side to that suffering, so that for every time that the Egyptians experienced suffering, the Jews of Goshen experienced some kind of blessing. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the plague of darkness. Because if you look in the Psukim, the Torah says, Lo ra'u ish es achiv, v'lo kamu ish mitachtav shaloshes yomim. That in Egypt, people couldn't see each other, nor people couldn't rise up against each other, which means, according to Chazal, that the darkness was so palpable and thick that you couldn't even move. It was just so paralyzing. And this was for 3 days. But for the Jewish people, there was light in all of their dwelling places. Says Rashi, Rashi asks the question, Lama hevi aleim choshech? Why was the plague of darkness brought upon the Egyptians? And Rashi gives two answers which are not really what we would normally expect. Because normally, if Rashi were to ask this question, first of all, it's a strange question for Rashi to ask in the first place, because Rashi does not ask this question for the other 7 plagues that came before darkness. Rashi doesn't say, Lama hevi alehem dam, Lama hevi alehem sefardea. Rashi specifically asks this, Lama hevi alehem choshech? Why did God bring darkness upon the people? Rashi gives 2 reasons. Neither of them have to do with the Egyptians. And this seems to indicate to us that the purpose of this plague was not primarily to punish the Egyptians, but was rather to make a provision for the Jewish people. And so Rashi gives us 2 answers. Number 1, he says, Shahayu b'Yisrael ba'osok dohador v'sha'im, that there were certain Jews of that generation who were evil, who were not righteous, and were not worthy of leaving Egypt. And therefore those Jews died during the 3 days of darkness. And in order to avoid the embarrassment or the degradation to the Jewish people and their reputation, Hashem didn't want the Egyptians to see the Jewish people dying before they left. This would sort of diminish their esteem for the Jews in some way. And so God caused these Jews to die, these unworthy Jews to die during the plague of darkness. That's reason number 1 why God brought darkness to the Egyptians. You see that he really brought darkness to the Egyptians for the sake of the Jews. Reason number 1. Reason number 2, which is also for the sake of the Jews, says Rashi, Va'od shechipsu Yisrael v'ra'u es kelehem. The famous Midrash Rashi quotes, which says that during the plague of darkness, because the Jews had special vision that they could see, even though the Egyptians could not see, they were able to go and find all of the hiding places of the Egyptians where they hid their valuables, so that when it came time for the Jews to leave Egypt, and they said, may I please have your valuables? And the Egyptian would say, I'm sorry, I'd love to give it to you, but I don't have any. The Jew would say, what are you talking about? Look in the 3rd drawer in your bureau, and it's right there, right? And so this, Rashi says, was the second reason. So again, Rashi gives 2 reasons for the plague of darkness. Neither of them has to do with a punishment to the Egyptians per se, but rather an accommodation for Klal Yisrael, for the glory of the Jewish people. Now, this, I believe, is alluded to in the words, L'chol b'nei Yisrael ha'ya'or b'moshav osam, that for the Jewish people there was pure light in their dwelling places. And I'm just quoting, there's a paragraph from the Shem Shmuel, Rabbi Shmuel of Sachatshav, who lives in the early 20th century, a very important Hasidic commentator, really just inspiring words of Torah. And he quotes from his Zaidi, the Kutzker Rebbe. And he quotes the Kutzker as saying that when it says, Ulachol b'nei Yisrael ha'ya'or b'moshav osam, this was not just regular light that the Jewish people had in their dwelling places. This was the light about which God said, Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or Vayihi Or. That God said, let there be light, and behold, there was light. There was not just a normal illumination through photons, through beam particles of light, but rather this reflects a spiritual light that the Jewish people gained as a result of the plague of darkness. And it turns out that both explanations in Rashi really converge on this idea, is that the way that we understand the Kutzker is that those Jews who were not worthy were not able to be privy to this divine light, this divine illumination, which was now permeating the souls of the Jewish people for the first time. And therefore they had to perish before God could expose this great light to the Jewish people. And that's why they had to pass away before God could expose this light to Klal Yisrael. And using the second explanation of Rashi, this light was the very thing that gave the Jewish people what the Torah calls chen. Chen is what the Jewish people possessed, which is what prompted the Egyptians to part readily with their possessions and give it to the Jewish people before they left. Chen is very difficult to translate. We can translate it as comeliness, as sort of attractiveness. But chen really means is some kind of spiritual quality that an individual has, that they radiate a certain aura which makes you want to like them, which makes you want to give them things. And that chen was a result of this light, Ulachol b'nei Yisrael haya or b'moshe v'asam, that Hashem illuminates the Jewish people, irradiates the Jewish people with this spiritual light, and that gives them this attractiveness and the desire that the Egyptians have to say, what a holy people. We see the aura bouncing off of them, and we want to be part of them in some way, so let us give them our possessions. And the Shem Yishmuel just takes it one step further. We won't have time, unfortunately, to read the text, but he says that whereas one might think that the light was a way of compensating for the darkness, the exact opposite is true. It's that Hashem, at this point in the evolution of the Jewish people becoming a nation, Hashem needed to expose the Jewish people to the spiritual light of creation. There is a medrash that says that when Hashem first created light, and it's a very famous Rashi, that Hashem took that initial incipient light of creation and hid it away for the tzaddikim la'asid lava. Took the light and put it away somewhere, and hid it somewhere in the celestial realm that he would later expose to the righteous in a future generation. And the reason why Hashem does that is because when a person is not primed for spiritual luminescence, you can abuse that light. The light that Hashem has prepared for people to experience very, very deep spiritual experiences can turn into something very superficial. It's almost like, by analogy, if we would say there are two different kinds of love. There's lust, and then there's a deep kinship that a man and a woman share with each other. The two of them externally may look the same, and there's like a concept called love, which can be either used in a very self-gratifying kind of way, and it can be used in a very, very deep kind of way. And so the divine light is like that. It provides a sense of clarity, but you can sometimes take that clarifying light and use it in a very superficial way, and therefore Hashem couldn't provide that light to the world at the time of creation. The world wasn't ready for it. But the Jews at this stage were now ready to internalize some kind of divine revelation, divine light that Hashem was providing for them. And as a result, because the rest of Egypt could not be privy to that experience because they would have abused that light, Hashem had to cause the rest of Egypt to descend into a darkness. So it almost turns everything upside down. It's not that because Egypt was dark, Hashem presented the Jews with light, but rather because Hashem needed to present the Jews with light, Hashem had to darken the rest of Egypt and cover up the light that he was presenting to the Jewish people. And it should provide us with a little bit of a lesson that sometimes there are certain things that happen in the world that may seem to be counterproductive. There are certain ideologies and ideas and cultures that seem to be circulating in the modern world, where you say to yourself, what's God's plan? Why is He allowing these things to take place in the world around us? But understand that there are different manifestations of the same ideal. And for some people, they will take a certain very holy ideal and distort it, but at the very same time, that ideal is being presented to the Jewish people for us to be able to sanctify it. So just keep that in mind. You can apply that to a number of different things, which I don't want to go too far afield of this, but I just want to sort of plant that into your imagination, and you can maybe think to apply to a number of different things. Sometimes there is light for the Jewish people where there's darkness for the rest of the world, but it's using the very same kernel of divine light, just that it's used differently for different people in the world. Have a great day, everybody.